And we're joined by our professional colleagues, David Drucker of the Washington Examiner in Washington, D.C., and John Fund of the National Review Online. I begin with John Fund because he's got a story up at NRO that is dear to me, having read so much New York State political history. This is Tammany Lives in the 21st century. As I understand it, the short version, the Board of Investigations, which is an apparatus in New York City, decided to investigate the Board of Elections' ability to fend off false voters, fraudulent voters, phonies, people who don't really exist. So it sent out a test to 63 polling places, and in the end, 61 of the 63 false voters, all signing themselves as John Test, were able to cast their votes. This alone is not the scandal. The scandal is the Board of Elections decided to defend itself. Mr. Fund, a very good evening to you. How did the Board of Elections deal with this very unhappy news? Good evening to you, John.
Thank you. Just one correction, John. They voted in the names of people who were dead, sitting in jail, or had moved out of state. Then when they got into the polling place, they voted a write-in named John Test. So they cast a ballot, but it didn't mean anything because it didn't affect any result.
Thank you. And how did the Board of Elections defend its poor record?
They were shocked, John. They were appalled. They were appalled not at the incredible incompetence and fraud that the Board of Elections investigations had uncovered. They were appalled that this had come to light and been publicized. So they did three things at their first public meeting of this year. One, they sent Mayor de Blasio, who was elected with the help of the voter registration fraudsters at Acorn. They sent him a letter saying you should fire the person in charge of this operation. Two, they sent a letter to the Obama Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice saying, we want you to investigate to see if the civil rights of the felons and the minorities involved in this were violated. I guess they didn't ask about the dead, thankfully. And the third thing they did is they referred a letter of complaint to the 5 prosecutors of the 5 boroughs of New York saying you should prosecute these Board of Investigators because they were engaged in fraudulent activity, casting fraudulent votes, pretending they were someone they weren't.
So the Board of Elections wants the Board of Investigations arrested, charged, jailed, and pilloried.
Yes.
Wonderful. Tammany is alive. We go immediately to Washington, D.C., where it's not Tammany, but it is the Democratic machine in the U.S. Senate run by Harry Reid of Nevada. And David Drucker joins. And Thaddeus, this is Congress as you know it to be, a cynical place where your word on Friday is no comment on Monday. It has to do with Harry Reid, who apparently promised an amendment voting for the unemployment insurance extension vote that's under debate. David, has Harry Reid forgotten what he said last Friday? Good evening to you.
Good evening. And the negotiations, the last I checked this evening, were still underway, and the compromise that is, I'm told, in development would include whatever the deal is, plus votes on some number of Republican-sponsored amendments to the unemployment insurance bill. And Reid is still expressing some desire to allow that. Mitch McConnell said he's hopeful that those votes will be allowed. And when I spoke to Dean Heller, the Republican senator from Nevada, who's the lead Republican negotiator in this, he said that a deal would include votes on Republican amendments, not necessarily that they'd be adopted, but the votes, and that's a separate issue that Republicans are demanding, and I believe are necessary, or you will not have enough Republican votes to get this thing to 60 votes and on to final passage. And so if there's a deal, and they're going to be discussing it Tuesday during caucus meetings, it will have to include votes on some Republican amendments. And if Reid agrees to that, I believe, part of the discussion will then be, fine, which amendments will get the vote, because they're not going to allow, the Democrats are not going to allow anything, for instance, that has to do with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act.
Thaddeus, I ask you about unemployment insurance. Is that a vital issue for the country right now? We had that terrible jobs report on Friday, but all the smart guys tell me it's a one-off to ignore it. So are people thinking unemployment and despair?
Well, clearly the smart guys aren't looking for work, or they would care about that number. I guess my question for John and Mr. Drucker would be, where are the cross currents? Obviously, Mr. Reed thinks he has a winning hand with the unemployment insurance, and they're going to wave it over all the Republicans. But there must be some open seats, or there must be some Republican incumbent senators that are very, very cautious and very chary about this upcoming vote because they come from economically recessed states.
Well, it's a good question, and if you look at the Republicans that voted with Democrats to advance this bill to the debate stage, they do come from either swing states or states that have not felt the benefits of whatever the economic recovery is that have been felt in some regions. But none of these senators, and I'm going through them quickly in my head, I believe are up for re-election or up for any competitive re-election. In fact, none of them may be up for re-election. And there is some difference of opinion because Republicans believe to some degree that as long as the administration is waving the flag about how desperately needed these unemployment insurance benefits are, that this extension is, that it sends the message to voters that the economy isn't actually doing all of that well, and that it's complicated politically to say on the one hand we're in the midst of a great recovery, on the other hand the recovery is so great you need that much more help. And so Republicans have some bit of confidence, and particularly in the House, that this isn't something that they have to fear.
Go ahead, Mr. Fund.
Well, yes, of course people are nervous because the unemployed, many of them are in desperate straits. However, if you look at the polls, especially the Quinnipiac and the Gallup polls that are out, 54% of Americans do believe that unemployment insurance does last too long for many Americans, and that there needs to be some cutoff point to it. I believe that most Republicans can weather this very easily, and I think that their stance that they will pass unemployment insurance, but only if they're genuine and real budget cuts elsewhere in the bloated federal budget, I think that can be something that can be sustained in any district or state.
Gentlemen, quickly, earlier Thaddeus and I were discussing Chris Christie, and Mr. McCotter made the point that anyone who is pilloried by the media, as Mr. Christie has been these last days, is all right with the Republican Party. Is that the way you put it, Thaddeus?
That's not quite how I put it, but it certainly does for someone, especially Governor Christie, who's been, quote-unquote, accused of being a moderate politically. To have the national media skewering you and standing tall does appeal to a large segment of the Republican Party.
John, 59% approval rating in New Jersey. Can Chris Christie get in more trouble? It seems to help him.
Well, again, the scandal has reached his staff office, the people he trusted around him. I don't believe that any documentary evidence will be found tying him directly to the traffic slowdowns. But if that were the case, it would be, given his emphatic statements on it, a complete disaster. I think that the media nationally has anointed him the front runner for the Republican nomination, and they've treated him almost as if he were a president in terms of the intensity of the coverage. And it's just completely out of whack. I mean, 50 times the amount of network news coverage of this traffic scandal as opposed to the IRS scandal over the last 6 months.
David, is traffic a big story on the Hill these days?
Well, this issue is a huge story in Washington because, of course, this is what we do. We focus on things that are salacious, and particularly if those salacious items have to do with Republicans. That's just the way it is. And so, it's a story. It'll last as long as it lasts. And I think for Christie, there are two things to fear, and John touched on one, which is if he actually did know about this, then it's death, because he was so unequivocal and emphatic about not knowing about it personally. And the other thing is that if he didn't know, ultimately at some point he'll end up unscathed and he'll emerge from this. But the longer it takes, if it goes on like this for 6 months to a year, it could be somewhat debilitating in that donors and experienced party operatives and just voters in general sometimes grow weary of something like this, and they want to move on to something fresh. And that's really the only thing he has to look out for at this point if he keeps handling this at the same level that he did last week at the news conference.
David Drucker, senior congressional correspondent at the Washington Examiner, John Fund of the National Review Online, and my colleague and co-host Thaddeus McCotter at the great voice of the Great Lakes, WJR, in Detroit, Michigan. I'm John Batchelor.